Um, Hi, we of sevengifts.org. We are with Pier for reader, writer, and journalist, author of many books. And today we speak to the one of his famous book. This the Templars. This is the English edition, and there are an Italian edition that in the 119 make the anniversary.
Yes, yes.
Paul.
Yes.
Yes. How are you? How are you?
I'm good.
We are in London, and his study.
Yes.
Is a very kind man to welcome us.
You're very welcome.
And we wanted to talk about your book, and we start with the first question. If you tell us how did you have the idea to make this book?
I'd written a novel, a fiction, called Knights of the Cross, and it was a story, a sort of a thriller, an adventure story, which involved these order of knights in Germany. Do you know who I mean by the Knights of Malta? The Knights of Malta. It was a slight satire on the Knights of Malta. And the novel, the publisher liked the novel, and he said I'd be interested to know about these military orders, the real military orders. Would you write a history book about them? So he suggested that I write a book about the Templars. Until then I hadn't really known much about it. I studied history at university, so I had some background knowledge. And so I started work and did a lot of research and became very interested.
How many documents have you found to write this book? Real document?
I did it mostly from what's called secondary sources. There's been a lot of development in the history of the Crusades. I mean, in England there was a very great famous history by someone called Sir Stephen Runciman, who was very against the Crusades and said the Crusaders were all greedy and cruel and all they wanted was to get the money from the Middle East. And then more recently, some historians, particularly Catholic historians, have actually done more research and found that wasn't really true, that most of the Crusaders who went on crusade expected to die. It was a kind of armed pilgrimage, and that it was started not as an idea of conquering and looting, but to save Jerusalem to liberate Jerusalem from Islamic forces, from the Muslims.
Can you speak about the stereotype that the people have about the Templars?
About?
The Templars. The stereotype.
Well, the things were confused by the success of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. I mean, my book came out before the Da Vinci Code, and I was very pleased that in one bookshop there was a pile of my books of a little notice saying, read this book, this tells the truth about because the Da Vinci Code is full of fantasy, and people, they love the idea of the Templars being this sinister order, Freemasons, with the history going back to the Temple of Solomon, and all sorts of magical powers and treasure, and proper historians realise that's all nonsense, not true at all. And I think one of the reasons that my book was successful was because it stuck very, very closely to true history and didn't go in for all this fantasy.
So we we prove you if you are study history. Or we prove if you are study history.
Yes, I studied
Yeah.
history, yes.
Yes. um,
There are many books about the Templars,
Oh.
but there was one in particular which was interesting, which proved what nonsense some of the theories were about
yeah.
magic and treasure and all that.
But about the Templars, how they are born?
How did they work?
No, how the Templars are born, like order, military order.
Well, there already existed before the Crusades a military order that had a hospital in Jerusalem. That was the Order of the Knights of St. John. When the First Crusade succeeded in capturing Jerusalem, a lot of the Crusaders went back to Europe, and there was a problem about protecting the pilgrims who came out as a result of the Crusade, the Christian pilgrims from Europe. And there were 6 or 7 knights, very devout knights, who were going to become monks, I think. But then the King of Jerusalem persuaded them to remain knights to protect the pilgrims. So they founded this temple, this order, which was given as their base in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount. And so they became known as the Knights of the Temple. I mean, their first title was the foot soldiers of the Lord Jesus Christ, or something like that, but they became known as the Knights of the Temple. And then the Knights of St. John, who'd been running the hospital, also became a military order. And as we say, it was an idea whose time had come, because these knights took vows as monks, or very similar vows. The order, their rule, the rule, was drawn up with the help of St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And it was a very, very strict monastic rule. They had to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And the vow of obedience was very useful in the military sense, because in those days knights were prima donnas, you know, they did what they wanted, they didn't like discipline, they didn't like being told what to do. But the Templars, who were knights, had to obey their Grand Master, and so they became a very disciplined military force. The second advantage was that a lot of European princes, dukes, knights, who wanted to go on crusade, but couldn't leave their territory, because if they did, somebody might make trouble, thought they would pay instead for the Knights Templar, because being a knight was very expensive. It's like having a tank or something. And so these gifts of land and property all over Europe were given to fund, to pay for the military orders. And so the military orders became eventually very, very rich. And of course that was their downfall, because when they were thrown out of, when the Latins, the Catholics, were thrown out of the Holy Land, there were these rich military orders without really anything to do. And the Knights of St. John were very clever. They went to Rhodes and became a naval force with the Knights of Malta, and then they went back to Malta. Whereas the Templars had no base really, and the King of France, Philip the Fair, wanted their property. So he suddenly arrested them all, charged them with all sorts of dreadful things, and hoping to get their property. And in fact, the Pope then, he closed the order.
We speak about after about this
right,
aspect.
okay.
And you have said that they are Knights of Jerusalem. And can you speak about the importance of Jerusalem for the religion and the importance of pilgrimage of the medieval people.
Yes, well, again, I think it hasn't been known until now, but I think Jerusalem fell to the Muslims in was it the 8th century, I think, and 9th century, and it remained under the rule of Muslims, but Christian pilgrims were permitted to go out there, and there was a steady stream of pilgrims, particularly taken by the merchants from, is it Benevento in Italy, and for example, I think a few years before the Crusade, several thousand pilgrims from Germany went to the Holy Land. So it wasn't as if pilgrimage wasn't common in those days, it was common. The Crusade came about because the Seljuk Turks had invaded the Byzantine Empire and threatened the city of Constantinople, and the Byzantine Emperor sent delegates to the Pope, because the Pope was then really the most important person in Western Christendom, and asked for help to fight the Turks. But the Pope then was called Urban II. He was himself from a sort of knightly family, and he realized that he couldn't persuade European knights to go and fight for the Byzantine Emperor. They didn't like him much anyway. So he decided that he would make the liberation of Jerusalem the objective of the Crusade, because that would inspire. I mean, Jerusalem was, you know, the holy city, the city where Christ was crucified, and that would inspire the Crusaders to really risk their lives to liberate it from the Muslims.
So, what's the role of the Muslims in the history of the Templars?
Well, they
it was very complicated because some had our favorite, some felt against. Yes.
I mean, as you know from the book, it's a complicated story, and some of the first Crusaders, as time passed, got quite settled in and really preferred to get on quite well with the Muslims and not to fight them. But then the new people who came out to fight Crusades wanted to go on fighting the Muslims, and the Templars on the whole, because they were religious and devout, also wanted to fight the Muslims, and so they could be counted on to fight in the Muslim army. The order became very rich in Jerusalem, but they were very devout, and when, you know, the Battle of Hattin, when Saladin defeated the Crusaders, the Knights Templar were offered their lives if they would convert to Islam, and none of them agreed to that, so they were all executed. So they're really they're martyrs for the Catholic faith, although there was no Templar was ever made a saint.
So, there is a urban legend, I don't know if it's true or false, that the Templars, perhaps you have speak before something about this, but the night of Jerusalem, the Templars are so many rich, and in the continue of the century they have corrupted. They are demoniac. It's true? It's false?
I think it's false. I think it's false.
Okay.
I mean, from all the research I did, and even some work by people who were not favourably disposed towards the Templars. I think they were remarkably uncorrupt. I mean, as always in the Catholic Church, you get what I call institutional pride, you know. We see that all over Europe with these monasteries like palaces, you know, Melk in Austria, or it's extraordinary. We were just in Germany, and you know, Salem are huge, like a palace, these monasteries. But the individual monks weren't rich. It's just the monastery was rich, and it was the same with Templars. And when they were dissolved, when the order was dissolved, there really was no money in their bank because they had enormous expenses. First of all, they had mercenary soldiers working. Soldiers they paid. Mercenaries, do you know what I mean? A mercenary is a soldier who is paid to fight.
Yeah.
And they employed soldiers to fight with them. Secondly, they built these fantastic fortresses, you know, Crac de Chevalier is one of the Hospitaller knights, and most of the Templar knights, castles have been demolished, but these were very, very expensive. And although they had very extensive properties in Europe, sending money, they needed the money and they spent it. So I don't think there was any individual corruption, and I think the charges, perhaps we'll come on to the dissolution, but the accusations made against them weren't false.
Okay. And it's false that they don't have the Holy Grail. It's false.
No, I think they were just brave. They were knights coming from not the top aristocracy, but the sort of medium aristocracy. They were mostly illiterate. They mostly couldn't read, because in those days a knight didn't bother to read. It was something for the clergy.
It's a legend. The Holy Grail and the Ark of Alliance.
Yes.
Is not
nonsense.
It's not nonsense.
No, no.
It's not in the treasure of the Templar.
No, I think those are all myths.
Yeah.
And that, as a Catholic, I find them tiresome myths because they detract from the courage and holiness of the Templars.
Yeah. What have Crusade the handed of the Templars? Yes, the King Philip and French, but these external causes. There are some internal causes for you that have caused the hand of the Templars.
I didn't quite understand. Internal crisis?
Internal crisis, yeah.
Whether? I can't remember. It's 20 years since I wrote the book, so
for you, there are some internal enemies that caused the crisis of Templars?
Yes. Well, I think they aroused a lot of envy because they were so rich. But they fought very bravely in Acre, you know, the fall of Acre, which was the last battle when the Christians were driven out of the Holy Land by Baibars, the Egyptian caliph. But they fought very big. But the problem then, they fell back on Cyprus, but they didn't really have a raison d'être, because, I mean, there were many plans to return to re-invade the Holy Land, but they never came to anything. And as I said earlier, the Knights of St. John went to Rhodes and became a naval power, and they then were thrown out of Rhodes, but they went to Malta, and they became the Knights of Malta, and they had, you know, they were a navy fighting for the Christian cause. But the Templars really didn't do much. They had a Grand Master, they had their meetings, they had their knights, and this is what made the king, who was very keen on needed money, feel that they should be dissolved.
The Grand Master is a very powerful
figure. Yes, he is. But he didn't have a role because there was no fighting to be done. If they didn't have ships, they couldn't fight. They expected to fight, you see. For many years after, they expected... I mean, popes went on calling for crusades well into the 18th century, I think. I mean, you know, the crusade was always something, was a project, a program for the Catholic Church. But for one reason or another, they never really became able to re-invade the Holy Land. They had to fight the Turks in the Siege of Vienna or in different parts of Europe, but not in the Middle East.
So what's the role of the King of France, Philip, and the Pope? Because we know that the Pope is not strong in this time.
No.
Is less Pope.
He was a weak Pope.
Weak Pope.
And I think he was very vulnerable because I think they were moving at the time to Avignon, so he was very close to the armies of the King of France. And Philip the Fair was a fairly ruthless king. I mean, to give the kings their due, they had increasing expenses, and the church. I mean, it's always a problem for the Catholic Church that in the early days these devout, pious noblemen, landowners, would give these great bits of land to the church. So the church became richer and richer and richer, and the kings desperately needed money to run the state and fight wars and pay their soldiers, saw all this money, all these properties owned by the church, and felt, well, that money should be spent, I should have that money to spend on running the kingdom. And it's a complicated story, but in the end, Philip the Fair, it was monstrous, really. He you know, it was like a modern police state. He arrested all the Templars in France and then persuaded other countries to do the same and accused them of these terrible things, you know, blasphemy and sodomy and devil worship, which are ridiculous charges, really. There's no evidence that any of them were true. And they were tortured, and then when they went back they confessed under torture, and when they retracted their confessions they were burnt as heretics, some of them, including Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master. It was a terrible story, but the Pope quite cleverly managed to keep the properties out of the hands of the king, and most of it went to the other order, the Knights of St. John, who in turn became very rich.
But you have speak about Jacques de Molay, the last
Yes.
Grand Master. Can you speak about him?
Well, it's very difficult, you know.
His figure.
Huh?
His figure.
I think he was a little stupid, actually. I think he was a good man.
Mm-hmm.
He took himself very seriously as the Grand Master, but I don't think he could read or write. Where the Knights of St. John were very clever is they employed lawyers, and the Templars didn't employ lawyers. They didn't think it was necessary, and so they really had no one to defend them. No one, because in those, people always think the Middle Ages were lawless, but they weren't. There were many, many lawyers around, and their courts could frustrate even the king. And Jacques de Molay, I think he was, one often thinks of European soldiers now, sort of brigadiers or generals. They're brave, but sometimes rather stupid. And I think, from what one knows, he was like that. But you see, he didn't write. I don't think he left much record of his life. So it's very difficult to know exactly who he was, what he was like. He was very brave at the end, I think, very courageous when he was burned.
For you, it's true or false the malediction that he have done?
Yes.
It's true or false?
Did you say within a year it will?
There is history.
Yes.
That Jacques de Molay,
Yes.
when he's dead on the fire,
Yes.
they have give to a malediction on
Yeah.
the king.
A curse, we'd say, a curse.
Yeah,
Yes,
on the king and to the pope.
yes,
And one year, the next year, that
we would
the
die.
king and
And the Pope. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
for you, it's true. Is
Well, could be coincidence.
is a myth.
Or I think it's true that they died within a year, yes.
Mm.
But whether as a result of the curse, the malediction, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's only God knows.
Okay. The last question
Mm.
for you. What is the Templars leave us today?
Well, I think I rather miss the spirit of the Templars. I'd like to see more. I mean, the Church has obviously given up the idea of crusades, and I mean, this is all very difficult now because of the relations between Europe and Islam and migrants and all that. But I think there are several Catholic thinkers and philosophers and writers who think that the Church is too weak in the face of people who are its enemies, that it won't recognise that it has enemies because it thinks charity demands that you feel love for everyone, and of course one should feel love for everyone. But the fact is the Church does have enemies. There are people who want to destroy it and do it down in many ways. And so I sometimes regret that we don't have more of the spirit of the Templars among the Catholic laity in confronting the enemies of the Church.
So, thank you.
Do you agree with that or not?
Okay, it's okay. Thank you so much.